The storm swallowed the world. Snow swept across the Montana wilderness like an endless tide, white upon white, cold upon silence. The air itself felt alive, whispering, twisting, hiding every direction in a blinding storm of light and frost. And yet, through that chaos, a single sound broke through. Not the wind, not the trees. A cry. Faint. Small. Somewhere ahead, beyond the drift. Ethan Cole stopped mid-step, breath fogging his scarf, eyes narrowing against the snow. The blizzard was thick enough to erase the path he'd just walked, but the sound came again. Higher this time, desperate. He dropped the bundle of firewood he'd been carrying and pushed forward. One step, then another. Through the pale curtain, a shape began to form. Something dark and still half buried in snow. He knelt beside it, brushing away frost with his glove. A small body shivered beneath his touch, too small to survive the night. A puppy, he thought at first. But when its eyes opened, the thought faltered. They weren't the cloudy blue of the newborn, and they were gray. Cold, luminous, almost metallic. They didn't look at him, but into him. Ancient, calm, unafraid. The little creature trembled, but it didn't try to bite, didn't whine again. It just watched him. And in that stillness, Ethan felt something stir, a quiet, fragile thread of recognition. He wrapped the creature inside his jacket close to his chest, and began the slow walk home through the storm. The cabin was a faint orange glow against the white. Inside, the fire struggled but held. Ethan closed the door behind him and fell to his knees, shaking snow from his coat. He laid the tiny body near the hearth, rubbing its fur gently with a towel, whispering words he hadn't spoken in years. Soft, human things meant for comfort. When the creature's breath returned, it made a sound unlike any animal he'd known, a low, hollow hum, almost like a sigh. He fed it milk warmed on the stove, and after a long while it raised its head and looked at him again. Those strange eyes reflecting the firelight like silver glass. "You're safe now," Ethan whispered. He smiled, a small, unfamiliar motion that felt like remembering how to live. He hesitated, then added quietly, "I'll call you Ash." The name fit. The creature's fur was the color of smoke, dark where it should have been light, soft where it should have been coarse. Ash curled beside the fire and slept. Ethan sat watching the flames, the storm still raging outside. For the first time in 3 winters, he didn't feel alone. Before the war, Ethan Cole had been a builder, hands that raised homes, not rifles. He'd left pieces of himself scattered across deserts and mountains, places that echoed long after the guns went quiet. When he came home, silence was supposed to be healing. But silence is never empty, it remembers. Every creak of the cabin floor, every gust of wind across the roof, it all spoke to him in the language of things lost. So he moved further out, 10 miles past the last mailbox, down a dirt road swallowed by pine. There, among snow and solitude, he tried to rebuild what was left. The cabin became his world. 4 walls, a stove, a shelf of old books, and now, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Days passed and the storm lifted, leaving a world buried in glass-white stillness. Ash survived, stronger than any creature that small had the right to be. Ethan found scraps of meat for him, fed him carefully, spoke in low tones. Ash never barked, never cried. He simply watched. Wherever Ethan went, the animal followed. To the shed, to the stream, to the woodpile where the axe rose and fell. Sometimes when Ethan looked back, he'd find those pale eyes waiting, patient, unblinking. By the time the last snow melted, Ash had grown almost twice his size. His fur darkened into a deep charcoal black, and when the sunlight touched it, it shimmered like steel. He didn't behave like a dog. He didn't move like one either. There was precision in him, awareness, as if he belonged to an order older than obedience. But Ethan didn't care about the strange. He cared about the silence it broke. At night, Ash would sleep near the fire, his breathing steady and calm. When nightmares shook Ethan from sleep, Ash would lift his head, those eyes reflecting firelight anchoring him back to now, and somehow the memories that had once haunted him began to fade. It was late March when the forest changed again. The days were longer, the nights clearer, but the woods had grown too still. No birdsong, no rustle of deer. Even the creek seemed to whisper quieter. Ethan noticed prints in the thawing snow, large, deep, spreading in patterns that didn't belong to any coyote or bear. He followed them a little way until they vanished into the shadow of the trees. When he returned, Ash was waiting on the porch, staring into the same darkness. His fur bristled, not in fear but recognition. That night, Ethan dreamed of eyes in the forest, silver gray and watching. When he woke, Ash was already standing by the window, alert, muscles taut under his coat. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw a shape move between the trees, something tall then gone. He told himself it was just the wind. But deep down, he knew the wind didn't move like that. 2 days later, Ethan drove down the mountain to visit Tom Henderson, the nearest soul within 10 miles. Tom was a rancher, old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who could tell a seasoned story by how the pine needles fell. When Ethan stepped out of the truck, Ash followed. Tom froze mid-step, his weathered eyes narrowing. "Where'd you get that one?" he asked. "Blizzard back in January," Ethan said. "Found him near the ridge." Tom crouched, studying Ash like a man reading a map. After a long moment, he said quietly, "You sure that's a dog?" Ethan frowned. "What else would he be?" Tom straightened, uneasy. "Not saying he ain't friendly. Just saying, I've seen prints like that up north, big ones. He's got the look of something wild. Just keep him close, will you?" Ethan smiled, half amused. "Don't worry, Tom, he's harmless." Tom didn't laugh. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, a word Ethan didn't catch. Later, as he drove back up the trail, that word echoed faintly in his mind. It sounded like chosen. Spring turned to summer and the forest came alive again. Ash grew faster than Ethan could believe. By June, he stood hip-high and moved with an ease that made other animals vanish into the underbrush. He'd follow Ethan to the river, fetch tools without command, and sometimes stare at the sky as if remembering something long ago. In quiet moments, Ethan would find himself talking to him, not like a pet but a friend. He'd tell stories of the desert, of men who'd never come home, of guilt that refused to die. Ash would listen, head tilted, eyes calm, and somehow that was enough. The nightmares came less often. The silence, once so heavy, began to sound like peace again. It was the kind of life Ethan had never thought he'd find, but peace is a fragile thing, and sometimes it ends without a sound. Summer slipped away quietly, the way peace always does, unnoticed until it's gone. The air grew colder, sharper. The forest turned from green to gold, then to silence again. Ash had grown into a creature of beauty, tall, dark, and impossibly graceful. His paws pressed barely into the dirt as he moved, his coat shimmering like smoke under the moon. Sometimes, when the light caught him right, Ethan thought he saw silver veins running beneath the fur like threads of frost. He wasn't a dog anymore, not really, but Ethan never said it out loud. To name something strange is to make it real, and Ethan wasn't ready for that. The change began subtly. Ash started staying out longer. At first hours, then whole nights. He would vanish into the forest at dusk and return before dawn, silent and unmarked, his fur cold with dew. One morning, Ethan found him sitting at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. The sun had just broken the ridge, but the light didn't reach his eyes. It was as if he was waiting for something, listening for something Ethan couldn't hear. That night, when Ash returned, there was blood on his muzzle. Not much, just a trace. Ethan froze. "What happened, boy?" he asked softly. Ash only looked at him, calm, unreadable, and sat down by the fire. Ethan reached out to wipe the blood away, and Ash leaned into the touch, eyes closing. The moment passed, but in that silence, Ethan's hand trembled. A few days later, Ethan drove down to town for supplies. He stopped by the small veterinary clinic on Main Street, partly to ask about shots, partly for reassurance. Dr. Avery, a young woman with tired eyes and steady hands, smiled when he mentioned the rescue. "You said you found him in the mountains?" she asked, taking notes. Ethan nodded. "During the blizzard, half dead." "Mind if I take a look at him?" "Sure." Ash sat quietly as she examined him, heartbeat steady, breathing calm. But as she lifted his lip to check his teeth, she froze, her brow furrowed. "These canines, they're too long," she murmured. Ethan tried to laugh. "Maybe just a big breed?" She shook her head slowly. "No, not like this. His jaw's too narrow for a mastiff, too strong for a husky. And his eyes..." She leaned closer. "I've never seen that color before." Her tone changed. No longer friendly curiosity, but quiet alarm. "Where exactly did you find him?" Ethan hesitated. "By the ridge near the tree line." "The northern ridge?" "Yes." Dr. Avery leaned back in her chair, thinking. Then she sighed. There are stories about wolves up there. Not normal packs and hybrids maybe from before the ban. But even hybrids don't look like this. Ethan crossed his arms, defensive. He's not dangerous. I didn't say he was, she replied gently. But keep him close, all right? Animals like that, sometimes they remember what they are before we do. On the drive home, the road cut through pine forests, burning gold with autumn. Ash sat in the passenger seat, calm as ever, head low, eyes on the horizon. Ethan wanted to believe the vet was wrong, that this creature, who'd kept him alive through the darkest nights, was still the same soul he'd carried from the storm. But in the reflection of the windshield, he thought he saw something different. Not the animal beside him, but something older, something watching. That night, the wind shifted again. The woods were restless. Leaves moved though no breeze passed through. Ash stood by the door, ears pricked, body still. Then without warning, he howled. It wasn't the voice of a dog. It was deep, ancient, a sound that seemed to rise from the bones of the mountain itself. It echoed for miles, scattering flocks of birds into the sky. Ethan's skin went cold. When the howl died, silence followed, heavier than before. The forest didn't answer. The next morning, Tom Henderson rode up on horseback, his face pale. "Ethan, you need to hear this." He dismounted, pulling his hat low against the wind. "Last night something took one of my calves. Didn't eat it. Just killed it. One bite, snapped the neck clean." Ethan frowned. "Bears?" Tom shook his head. "Too clean for bears. And too big for wolves. Whatever it was, it's not like anything I've seen." Ash appeared on the porch behind Ethan, silent, eyes fixed on Tom. Tom's horse snorted and backed up, nostrils flaring. Tom's voice dropped. "You seen anything strange out here?" Ethan hesitated. "No." Tom's gaze flicked to Ash. "You keep that animal close, Cole, because whatever's running in those woods, it might be calling to him." He left without another word. Ethan tried to work through the unease. He chopped wood, patched the roof, fixed the stove. But that night, when he lit the fire, he noticed Ash standing by the window again, staring into the forest, unmoving. The light flickered across his face, and for an instant, Ethan swore his eyes reflected silver, like a mirror catching lightning. He whispered half to himself, "What are you, Ash?" The animal didn't turn. Outside, something howled back, faint, distant, but identical. Ash lifted his head slowly and answered. The days that followed blurred together. Wind, ash, silence. Ethan began to dream again. Not of war this time, but of snow and eyes and a voice whispering his name. Sometimes he'd wake to find the cabin door open, footprints in the frost leading into the woods. Large ones, too large. He told himself it was sleepwalking. He told himself anything but the truth. But one morning, he followed the prints. They led deep into the trees, farther than Ash had ever gone before. There, in a clearing, the ground was torn apart. Claw marks in the dirt, feathers scattered, the scent of death still fresh, and at the center, half buried in snow, a carcass, deer, torn, untouched by scavengers. Ethan turned back slowly. Ash was standing at the edge of the clearing, silent, watching him. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not fear, not guilt, but something older. Recognition. Ethan whispered, barely audible. "You didn't." But Ash turned and walked away, deeper into the forest, his body blending into the shadows like smoke into fog. That night the wind carried a new sound, not howling, but voices. Many of them, faint, echoing from far away, rising and falling like chants. Ash stood at the door again, muscles tensed, head low. Ethan stepped closer, whispering, "Don't." But the animal's gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the moon rose red. Without a sound, Ash walked into the darkness. And for the first time since the blizzard, Ethan felt the cold again, the kind that no fire could. Drive out. Autumn hardened into winter once more. The first snow fell early that year, soft as dust but heavy in meaning. The world turned white again, just as it had the night they met. But this time the silence carried a different weight. Ash no longer slept by the fire. He stayed near the door, staring out into the woods as if something beyond the trees was calling. He ate less, moved slower in daylight, and when the moon rose, his restlessness returned. Ethan heard him leave sometimes, the crunch of snow, the whisper of branches as he passed. And when he returned before dawn, the forest behind him always felt emptier. Ethan tried to ignore it. He told himself this was nature, instinct, but deep down he knew something was pulling Ash away. One morning, the peace broke. A knock on the cabin door startled him awake. Through the frosted window, he saw two men in state park uniforms standing outside, snow-dusting their hats. "Mr. Cole?" one of them called. Ethan opened the door halfway. "Yes?" The older ranger nodded politely. "Sorry to bother you. We're investigating some wildlife incidents. Livestock deaths, missing pets. You seen or heard anything unusual out here lately?" Ethan hesitated. "No." The ranger's eyes moved past him toward the shape sitting quietly behind the stove. "Ash." The man's expression changed. "Mind if I ask what breed that is?" Ethan forced a small smile. "Found him during a storm last year. Some kind of husky mix, I guess." The younger ranger frowned. "That's no husky, sir. We've been tracking prints, big ones, wolf-sized. You sure that animal's domesticated?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "He's mine," he said quietly. "And he's not the problem you're looking for." The older ranger studied him a moment longer, then sighed. "All right, Mr. Cole, but be careful. Whatever's out there isn't acting like a normal pack. It's organized. It's hunting for territory." They left a pamphlet on the porch, reporting dangerous wildlife, and walked back down the trail. Ash hadn't moved. He sat watching the door, eyes like silver mirrors catching the firelight. That night, the wind rose again. Ethan lit the fire higher, poured himself coffee, and sat by the window. He could see the reflection of Ash beside him, tall, poised, still. Then suddenly Ash stood, ears pricked, body rigid. Outside, somewhere beyond the ridge, came a howl. Then another. Then many. It wasn't random. It was a pattern, deep, layered, commanding. And Ash answered. The sound that came from him wasn't a call. It was a reply, strong, certain, ancient. Ethan's coffee cup fell from his hand. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then Ash turned his gaze toward Ethan. Something passed between them, something wordless and heavy. Ethan whispered, "Don't go." But Ash was already moving. He stepped toward the door, pushed it open with a strength that startled even Ethan, and disappeared into the storm. Ethan didn't follow at first. He stood frozen in the doorway, the cold cutting into him like glass. Then instinct or love broke through fear. He grabbed his coat, his rifle, and a lantern and plunged into the night. The snow fell harder as he climbed the ridge. Every few steps he thought he heard movement, shapes darting between trees, flashes of eyes glowing in the dark. When he reached the clearing, the forest had gone silent again. Then he saw them, figures moving in the snow, not men, not entirely beasts. Wolves, but larger than any he had seen. Their coats were dark, their eyes pale, and they moved with a chilling coordination. At their center stood Ash. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't afraid. He was leading. Ethan froze. His lantern trembled in his hand. Ash turned slowly and their eyes met across the clearing, one filled with fear, the other with sorrow. Ethan whispered, "Ash, come home." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then one of the wolves growled, a deep, resonant warning. Ash stepped between them and Ethan, low and calm, as if commanding silence. But the pack's tension broke. A second growl, a lunge. Ethan fired a warning shot into the air. The sound exploded across the mountain. The wolves scattered, but Ash didn't move. He stood still, snow gathering on his coat, eyes glinting like glass. Then, without a sound, he turned and vanished into the trees. When morning came, Ethan returned to the cabin alone. He sat by the fire, staring at the rifle leaning against the wall. The sound of the shot still echoed in his head, louder than the storm, louder than the silence that followed. He didn't sleep for days. He went out every dawn, calling, waiting, hoping. Sometimes he found tracks, sometimes he found nothing. Winter deepened. The world turned white once more. Then one night, a sound broke the stillness. Faint scratching at the door. Ethan froze. Slowly he opened it. Ash stood there, thinner now, covered in frost, eyes dimmer than before. But it was him. Ethan dropped to his knees. "Ash!" The animal stepped forward and pressed his head against Ethan's chest. Gentle, tired. Ethan held him, tears falling silently into the dark fur. He whispered, "You came back." Ash made a low sound, half growl, half breath. Then his body gave way, collapsing against Ethan's arms. Blood stained the snow beneath them. A wound, small but deep, marked his side. A clean shot, like the kind fired by rangers trying to defend livestock. Ethan stayed there until dawn. When the light touched the horizon, Ash was still. They buried him by the ridge, the same place where they had met. The ground was frozen, but Ethan dug until the earth gave way. He placed the body gently, covering it with pine branches and snow. For a long time he stood there, the wind rising behind him like breath. From somewhere far off, another howl rose, long and low, fading into the distance. Ethan lifted his head. It wasn't a cry of anger. It was farewell. Weeks later, the rangers returned. They'd found the pack near the valley. All but one had moved north. Must have been a lone wolf left behind, they said. Didn't make it through the storm. Ethan only nodded. He didn't correct them. He didn't tell them that the lone wolf had once slept by his fire, that it had once answered to a name. When they left, he walked back to the ridge, hands in his pockets, snow crunching softly underfoot. There, beneath the old pine, he saw something glinting through the frost. A single silver hair, catching sunlight like steel. He smiled, small, quiet. The way a man smiles when something hurts but heals at the same time. He whispered, "Rest now, Ash. You were never mine to keep." And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. The winter passed slowly, like breath over glass. By February, the cabin roof bowed under snow, the air burned thin and the fire burned low. Ethan Cole lived in quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. Silence, once heavy, had changed its weight. Now it carried memory instead of loneliness. Some nights he'd hear the forest shift, the creak of pines, the distant howl of something moving north. He never feared it. He never tried to chase it away. It was, in some strange way, a comfort. He began to walk again, farther than before, tracing the old paths he and Ash had taken. The snow was shallower now, crusted over with light. At the edge of the ridge near the grave beneath the pine, he often stopped. The ground there looked untouched. No tracks, no marks, just peace. Sometimes he'd speak aloud, voice quiet against the cold. "You were right to go," he'd say. "The wild doesn't belong behind doors. Maybe love doesn't either." Then he'd smile, small, tired but honest. "Still, you saved me, didn't you?" That spring, when the snow began to melt, a pair of wolves was sighted near the valley. A mother, black as night, and a smaller one, gray-eyed, watchful. Ethan saw them once from a distance near the tree line. They didn't run when they saw him. They simply watched, calm still, before disappearing into the brush. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't take a picture. Some things aren't meant to be proven. When the evening fell that day, he returned home and sat by the fire, the orange light flickering against the walls. He poured himself a cup of coffee, though it had long gone cold. And then, without meaning to, he laughed. A quiet, disbelieving sound that filled the cabin like warmth. He started writing again. Small things at first. Notes, letters never sent. But soon stories came. Not of war or fear or loss, but of the bond that bridges what we are and what we dream of being. Stories of the wild, of loyalty without language, of love that has teeth but not malice. Sometimes when the words came slower, he'd look toward the window, and in the dark reflection, he could almost see those eyes again, gray and calm, waiting by the fire. The seasons turned. Years passed. The cabin aged but held. Ethan grew slower, softer, but never bitter. He tended the small garden each spring and spoke to the forest as though it might answer. And in a way it did. The wind through the trees sometimes carried a low hum. Not a howl, not quite a song, something between the two. He'd pause, listen, and whisper, "I hear you, old friend." In time, people in town began to forget the stories, the blizzard, the prince, the strange animal. But on certain winter nights, when the moon hung low and the snow shone like glass, a few said they saw shapes moving through the fog. Tall, graceful, eyes like silver light. Always two, never closer than the edge of sight. And always heading north, Ethan never spoke of it again. He grew old quietly as the wild does, without fanfare, without witness. When he passed years later, they found his journal beside the fire. The last entry was written in an unsteady hand, the ink smudged by a drop of melted snow. It read, "Some loves aren't meant to stay. Some are meant to remind us of what we are capable of." Gentleness, courage, belonging. I once rescued a creature from a storm. I thought I saved his life, but in truth, he saved mine. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, soft and steady like breathing. Snow fell lightly over the ridge, and somewhere far away, or perhaps very near, a howl rose through the night. It wasn't lonely. It wasn't sorrowful. It was just beautiful. The cabin light flickered once more, then dimmed to embers, and the forest, wrapped in quiet, kept the memory safe.